Okay, here we're going to look at some very specific classifications of hormones and a little bit more detail on how the different classifications of these hormones have different ways of entering and affecting cells. So starting first, hormones in general. Well, a hormone is a chemical signal that's produced in one part of the body and acts at a distant site. There's three main advantages to the body to using these chemical signals. One is it can spread to all tissues via the blood. So anywhere blood goes, which is throughout the entire body, these hormones can travel. In addition, they can persist much longer than electrical signals. Electrical signals, for example, would be in our nervous system, which also causes effects all over the body, but for a very short period of time. Hormones persist much longer in the body. They can act many act as hormones. So when we're looking here, these chemical signals, right, they're acting, an example would be as hormones, which we're going to investigate here. Now, different hormones can target different tissues. It's very important because what is secreted into the bloodstream will only affect target cells. It's not going to affect all cells. It's only going to affect target cells. The reason why I have the image here is these hormones create a balance that needs to occur. So a lot of times there's a lot of stresses on the body, and hormones need to maintain this balance or homeostasis on a daily basis. Now, how this is occurring is hormones need receptors. So we see a signal, we see a receptor, and we have an effect that occurs. For example, here's a hormone entering the cell. This one molecule is causing this cascade of effect, which is then resulting in a ribosome producing a protein, which is changing the cell's function. So one little hormone can cause a bunch of different steps to occur that ultimately, in this case, cause a change in the cell function. Now there's homology in hormones. So what does this tell you about the hormone prolactin? So we have prolactin, affects mammals and birds and fish and amphibians. It's related to kind of a growth hormone. So how does this hormone produce different effects? It's the same hormone. Well, as we see here, it's involved with milk production with animals. For birds, it's fat metabolism. For fish, it's salt and water balance. Amphibians, it's metamorphosis and maturation. Well, this kind of leads us to believe that this suggests that prolactin is an ancient hormone whose functions have diversified along with the evolution of various vertebrate groups. So we have this kind of single hormone that, depending on what animal it is, can affect, might have different effects within those particular species. So just kind of a way that we're looking at kind of one hormone if we're consuming, this is particularly for the man-made hormones, how that might be produced for one animal and how it can negatively impact or have a different impact on other species. Now, continuing how hormones target cells, well, they're steroid hormones. They're manufactured from cholesterol, they're lipid-soluble, and they can cross the lipid bilayer in the cell membrane. They bind to receptors within the nucleus, usually hormone receptor complex that binds to DNA, causing changes in gene activity. Then we also have anabolic steroids, which are synthetic compounds resembling testosterone. These cause muscle cells to produce more protein. So we have our steroid hormones and our anabolic steroids, which are synthetic, meaning man-made compounds. Kind of that version here with the Hulk. Now, classification of hormones. We have two major classifications. One is protein-based hormones. Those are polypeptides, small proteins, glycoproteins, or large proteins with carbohydrates, and amines, which are modified amino acids. Then we have our lipid-soluble based hormones, which are steroids, and they're modified cholesterol. And so it's important, again, to still keep in mind of the macromolecules, such as carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, and the different properties that these may have. Now, looking specific at lipid-soluble hormones, I'm going to investigate them just a little bit further here. We see lipid-soluble hormone in the blood cells here. Here's our red blood cells. It goes through the blood vessel, and we see lipid-soluble hormones diffuses through the plasma membrane. Hormone binds with a receptor in the cytoplasm, forming this complex. The receptor hormone complex enters the nucleus, triggering gene transcription. We see here a change in the DNA. And our transcribed mRNA, messenger RNA, is translated into proteins after that alter cell activity. So this single hormone gets into the nucleus, changes gene expression, ultimately resulting in a protein being made that can alter cellular activity. A steroid hormone directly initiates production of proteins within the target cell. So we want to compare lipid-soluble hormones to some of our other hormones. Now, steroid hormones are going to fall under this same category. This might be a little clearer to say, because here we have our steroid hormone directly entering the cell, creating the complex, going into the nucleus, binding the sites and the chromatin, activating mRNA transcription, resulting in a cellular response. These steroid hormones enter through the cell membrane and bind to receptors inside the target cell. These hormones may directly stimulate transcription of genes and make certain proteins. Because steroid hormones work by targeting gene activity, the response is slower than the other group we're going to look at, which is peptide hormones. So steroids follow the same category as lipid-soluble. Water-soluble are a little different here. So our water-soluble hormone, we notice here, is binding to a surface receptor. So water-soluble hormones are membrane-soluble. They bind to membrane receptors. So if we look back at the other one here, there was no membrane here. It just kind of went right through, right to the nucleus. These are lipid-soluble. Here we're focusing now on water-soluble. They bind and activate what's called the G protein. This then is causing it to then go through and enter the cell. So we're noticing we're not directly going into the nucleus. We're binding to surface proteins because they cannot diffuse directly through the cell membrane. They're water-soluble. They can't get by that phospholipid bilayer. These hormones must bind to surface cell membrane receptors before initiating a cell signal, as we see here. So there's still an activated protein in the end, but it's a very different pathway than our lipid-solubles. Continuing on these peptide hormone pathways, we see that receptor binding. These peptide hormones, these short peptides or full-size proteins, they do not enter the cell directly. They bind to receptors embedded in the cell membrane, as we see here. When the hormone binds the receptor, a secondary messenger molecule initiates a cellular response. We see that here, initiating this response, that then ultimately is going into the nucleus and causing the initiation indirectly of secondary messengers. This signal transduction is this multiple-fold increase in our message being received within the cell. Peptide hormones are water-soluble and often produce fast responses. Now, the benefits of this secondary messenger system is we have the signal that's binding, we have a receptor protein, and the key part here, we have this amplification steps that are occurring. So one single binding going through, we see these multiple amplifications. Then we see amplification from that. So from one binding, we generate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cyclic AMPs here. From those 8, each one of those can develop a protein kinase, which can produce a whole bunch of enzymes, which then produce a whole bunch of product. So this cascade multiplier response is also a very quick response. And this is how we can produce, the body can produce very small amounts of hormone and have a very large effect that occurs, a large response of product within the body system. So the benefits of the secondary messenger system is the amplification that can occur and the large amount of product that can be produced from a very small or relatively small amount of signal being produced initially by the body.